The biblical stories often present rivalries between women who, regardless of their position or status, seem to be keen to lock down a husband and produce him with heirs. Whether you look at Abraham's wife Sarah, who ends up in a conflict with her handmaiden Hagar, or whether it's the feud between the sisters Rachel and Leah, a man's love interest could certainly cause him significant drama and headache, especially when he had multiple women vying for his affections. Whilst the biblical patriarch in Adam never had to deal with two wives at the same time, Jewish legends and various apocrypha will have us believe that he was married twice in his life. Readers of these legends will understand that whilst Adam's first wife Lilith was a bit of a menace, his second wife Eve was a bit more well suited to him. On the one hand, you have this rebellious, fiery wildcat of a woman who, depending on the legend, either strives for equality in the relationship or demands outright sexual dominion over her spouse. Whilst on the other hand, you have a comparatively more innocent, nonchalant and agreeable wife who doesn't really rock the boat. Except for that one time. The question we'll be asking in today's episode then is, who really makes the better wife? Whilst looking to not only the biblical accounts to address this argument, but also the apocryphal stories and Jewish legends that might actually have you thinking that the answer isn't as easy as you originally might have thought. Who then will you be bringing home to meet mother? The amiable companion who was literally made for you? Or the seductive femme fatale who breaks all the rules? The traditional biblical narrative will have us believe that Adam only ever had one wife, that being Eve. Here in chapter 2 of Genesis, we are told that the biblical God recognizes that man should not be alone. Some interpret this to mean that Adam was lonely in the Garden of Eden, and that it would have been beneficial for him to have a human companion. We are told, "And the Lord God said, It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make a helpmeet for him." From this verse alone, you might allocate a point in the Eve column as to who would make the better wife. For unlike Lilith, Eve is actually made to be helpful. Her sole creation isn't just to provide Adam with companionship in the form of her presence, but to actually assist him in his day-to-day caretaking of the garden. In the Middle Ages account of the Alphabet of Ben Sira narrative, where the origin of Lilith is detailed to us, we aren't told that she was created for anything of the sort. Unlike Eve, who is a helpmeet, Lilith is given no such responsibility. Genesis continues that God causes Adam to fall into a deep sleep and then performs surgery on Adam, removing one of his ribs and forming that rib into the woman we come to know as Eve. When Adam awakens, he's pleased with her creation and proceeds to describe her as the bones of his bones and the flesh of his flesh, a recognition that she literally came from him. With this interpretation, you might again see Eve as the more logical choice as to who would make the better wife for Adam. Eve literally came from the body of Adam. She was, in some aspects, a part of Adam. And so in that respect, Eve could certainly be considered as a more safe bet. However, things take a bit of a turn in chapter 3 of Genesis, because Eve commits the transgression of all transgressions. As most readers will know, God cautions Adam and Eve not to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, telling them that if they sample the fruit from this tree, then they will surely die. However, the serpent also makes himself known and tells Eve quite the opposite, that not only would they not die, but they would become like God. Here we are told, "And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof, and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat." Eve falls hook, line and sinker for the serpent's deception, but if that wasn't bad enough, she's also seen to enable Adam to follow in her footsteps, and effectively bring about the downfall of both of them. Now, there are different ways to interpret this verse, with some saying that Eve merely handed Adam the apple for him to make his own decision, whilst others suggest that Eve, having gained the knowledge and thus now capable of deception herself, convinced Adam to eat and join her in her sin. This would then become the first strike against Eve, albeit what a critical strike it is. Eve's mistake here is nothing to scoff at. This is not a trivial error that one can simply overlook, but actually an infringement upon not only her own life, but also that of her husband's. One might argue that she knowingly dooms Adam to a fate of hardship and turmoil upon the earth, forever out of the paradise he has come to know, and firmly fixed in the wrath of his God. Indeed, one might even go a step further and say that whilst Lilith might have disobeyed God and actually antagonized him, at least she made those decisions on her own and did not forsake Adam in the process. After Adam and Eve are banished from the Garden of Eden and forced to make do off of the barren land of the earth, we see Eve give birth to her first sons, Cain and Abel. After this, Eve is seen to fade into the margins of the narrative and doesn't have much of a major role going forward. I mean, she does birth pretty much all the sons and daughters of Adam, so there's that. But the biblical account honestly seems pretty keen to usher her out of the spotlight at this point. Based on the Genesis account, does Eve make a good wife? Well, the second chapter of Genesis portrays her not just as a good wife, but the wife, the perfect companion to Adam in every conceivable way. However, the third chapter of Genesis shows us a far less reliable and trustworthy character, who not only spoils paradise for herself, but spoils it for her husband too. Now, you can argue here that people make mistakes in relationships, and considering this is Eve's first mistake, although a big one, she ought to be allowed some grace and given an opportunity to redeem herself. It's also true to say that after having transgressed so spectacularly, it might speak to her character that Eve isn't shown to sin ever again. In fact, one might say it's more admirable that she doesn't sin after she's lost her innocence, but rather chooses to live a more righteous and moral life in line with not only God, but her husband too. Adam's first wife, according to the Alphabet of Ben Sira, meanwhile, is presented as much less righteous and moral throughout the short amount of time that we know her for. As is the case with Eve, God declares that it is not good for man to have been alone, and so he creates Lilith not from Adam's rib, but from the earth, like him. In this, you might say that they are created equal. Lilith would certainly argue this later on in the narrative. Unlike the instant synchronicity that seems to envelop both Adam and Eve upon their meeting, Adam and Lilith are shown to immediately begin arguing with each other. The text tells us, "She said, 'I will not lie below,' and he said, 'I will not lie below, but above, since you are fit for being below, and I for being above.' She said to him, 'The two of us are equal, since we are both from the earth,' and they would not listen to each other." Straight off the bat then, Lilith is shown to be problematic. She will not take the submissive position during sex, and insists that Adam should fulfill this role instead. Adam, on the other hand, sees this position as beneath him, and refuses to acquiesce to her preference. Some would argue that as Adam was created first, Lilith ought to have respected his seniority, and simply done what was asked of her, an attitude that's perhaps more reflective of the time period in which it was written. A modern and perhaps more fair perspective would be that Adam and Lilith ought to have worked out a compromise for this dilemma, instead of insisting on their own preferences. The text tells us, however, that they would not listen to each other, with neither of them attempting to bargain, but rather demanding their own way. In this example, I would say both Adam and Eve are incompatible, but I would also argue that as Lilith is also portrayed as unwilling to suggest an alternative, she would likely make for an argumentative wife who would fight tooth and nail to ensure it was her way or the highway. On the one hand, you might say that her request to be on top isn't unreasonable, as she cites that both were created in the same manner, although Adam does maintain seniority. But it still leaves the fact that neither are willing to come up with a solution, and seem quite content to let their relationship slip into a complete stalemate. Adam is, without a doubt, part of the problem too, And you might argue that we don't know if Lilith would have been open to a compromise if he did perhaps introduce fairer terms. But Lilith isn't seen to offer these terms either, and considering she believed herself to be equal, it's plausible that if she had this idea, she would have presented it. Ultimately, both of them are pretty crappy partners in this example. But as we're here to address one's compatibility with Lilith, you might be keen to toss another point in Eve's column as to who would make the better wife, or at least who would make the easier wife to get along with. Another interpretation regarding this passage is that this is not about sexual positions at all, but rather a metaphor for the entire relationship dynamic, that both Adam and Lilith wanted to be in charge of the relationship, and neither were willing to cede any control to the other. So that's another point worth bearing in mind, that whilst some might be content to allow their wife to be sexually dominant, this dominance might actually spill over to other areas, and may perhaps even establish Lilith as wearing the pants, and you left wearing the panties. Again, some of you might be into the domineering matriarchal presence, and so for you, this might actually make Lilith a more appealing option. Some will likely point out that we only have to look at how Lilith behaves when she's told no. Her immediate response is the most extreme. She utters the ineffable name of God. She leaves paradise altogether. She quite literally transforms into something less human by growing wings. Evidently, Lilith doesn't handle conflict very well, and becomes rather self-destructive in the wake of the argument with her husband. This is not a character well adjusted to conflict resolution, but seems to be the sort of person that multiplies the fallout of the feud by acting brashly and emotionally. Lilith goes from one extreme to another. She's a powder keg that's one disagreement away from exploding, and doesn't seem to mind all that much as to how it might affect her. She isn't afraid of God, whom she has the nerve to not only utter his name, but also defy him by leaving the garden in the first place. She throws away everything she has because she could not get her own way. Not only then does this come across as a wife who's mentally unstable, but she also sounds dangerously unpredictable. The sort who might very well burn the house down because you refuse to agree to one of her demands. The Ben Sira narrative concludes that God sends 3 angels to retrieve Lilith, but by this point, Lilith has already transitioned into something of a mother of demons, who acknowledges that her only role now is to sicken babies. Interestingly, she is seen to come to an agreement with the angels. Evidently, she is capable of compromise, just not with her husband, in that if God allows her to stay where she is, she will not affect any baby who has an image or amulet with the names of the angels inscribed on them. She also concedes that as a result of her self-expulsion from the garden, 100 of her demonic children will die every day. Have you ever had that moment where years pass by and you serendipitously learn that your ex has since become the worst version of herself, and you think to yourself, holy shit, dodged a bullet there? Well, that's pretty much what I expect Adam would have thought in regards to Lilith, who, having been left by Lilith, probably counted his blessings now that she had become a literal demon. By these two accounts, Lilith by far sounds like a worse partner than Eve. Yes, Eve transgresses and condemns both herself and her husband to a life of hardship and struggle, but she is not seen to sin again, which suggests she atoned for her mistake. Lilith doesn't just spite Adam by leaving him, but she proceeds to throw herself completely toward the dark side and become a killer of babies, of Adam's own children, considering there wouldn't have been any others at this time. Comparing these texts enables us to see that whilst one wife might have been naive and foolish, the other is arguably psychotic, with an inability to regulate her emotions and a predisposition to going off the deep end. But if we were to consult the apocryphal texts, we might find that eating from the tree of knowledge, and perhaps tempting her husband with it, wasn't the only transgression committed by Eve, and that perhaps she wasn't nearly as good as the biblical text appears to imply. One idea stems from an interpretation of chapters 3 and 4 of Genesis, known as the serpent seed theory. In this version of events, the serpent that deceives Eve in the Garden of Eden was not just a wicked animal, but rather Satan himself, who had snuck into the garden to tempt and deceive Eve. However, he did not achieve this by only tricking her into eating from the tree of knowledge, but rather seduced her and impregnated her, that which resulted in Eve giving birth to Cain. This idea was then used to explain why Cain was so evil, and why he was capable of murder when such a thing had never transpired before. In this then, you might say that Eve cheated on Adam. In fact, she not only cheats on him, but she gives birth to her lover's baby, and depending on the version of this myth, keeps the truth from him and thus expects Adam to raise the child as his own. This is perhaps one of the more heinous things that Eve is portrayed as doing, and it's made even more worse, again based on the version of the myth that one is reading, that Eve would have known it was wrong, since she'd have by this point had knowledge of good and evil from having eaten from the tree. Is this then worse than Lilith's behaviour as a wife? Lilith might have been obstinate and unreasonable in her demands, but she is never shown to cheat on her husband. In fact, while she is seen in some later legends to couple up with Samael, this only transpires after she's already left the Garden of Eden and effectively broken up with Adam. In this, she technically does nothing wrong, unlike Eve, whose affair very much takes place in the thick of wedlock. According to the Legend of the Jews, a compendium by author Louis Ginsberg, Eve becomes so guilt-ridden that she actually exiles herself from Adam's presence, taking her baby with her. In this same account though, Adam is seen to still long for Eve, and so he reunites with her and proceeds to raise Cain as his own child. However, if we were to consult the apocryphal work known as Adam, Eve and the Conflict with Satan, we also learn that Adam actually separated himself from Eve after they were expelled from the garden, and that he was actually seduced by multiple demons, and perhaps even by a returning Lilith. With this idea in mind then, both Adam and Eve effectively cheat on each other, and the whole relationship takes on a far more tumultuous nature that's riddled with toxicity when compared to the standard biblical narrative. With such accounts in mind then, Eve as a wife might not be considered all that great either. I mean, there is an argument that Satan only seduced Eve before she'd eaten from the tree of knowledge, and so in her defense, you might say that she had no idea what she was doing, and that Satan had ultimately taken advantage of her. In this regard, I would consider Eve blameless, and she is sort of framed as more of a victim of rape than a sinful adulterer. According to various apocrypha and legends, there are some more mystical perks to marrying Eve and having her as a companion. In the Tree of Souls, a compendium of Jewish legends by Howard Schwartz, Eve has an ability known as night vision, where she is able to predict future events in her dreams. This prophetic ability sees her predict the death of her son Abel at the hands of her eldest son Cain, as well as the later birth of her son Seth, whose line would make up for the one lost by Abel's demise. This is further echoed in the apocryphal work known as the Apocalypse of Moses, where Eve is seen to dream of Adam being taken into a shining building and seated in a throne, which was believed to be a sign that Adam would soon die and be taken into heaven. So at the very least, even though Eve did enable man's expulsion from paradise, and even if she was seduced by the serpent, at the very least, she makes quite the capable seer. Again, one might argue that this is at least better than what Lilith offers, which, going by the Alphabet of Ben Sira, is virtually nothing. As aforementioned, in the apocryphal work, The Conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan, we understand there is a period after the death of Abel where Adam sinks into a depression and leaves Eve. Here, Adam is said to have been pounced upon by demons and seduced by them, going on to have many demonic children with them that then populated the earth. In his depression, it's entirely plausible that if demons were having their way with Adam, Lilith, for old time's sake, might have been at the very front of the queue. fulfilling her original desire to be on top, and symbolically putting Adam beneath her. In this sense, Lilith is eventually victorious over Adam, at least on this one occasion. In fact, one might argue that she not only achieves independence from Adam, but she positions him exactly where she wanted. She might not be his wife anymore, but the scales of power certainly lean in her favour in this speculative scenario. Some may see the appeal in this, in that having established this bitter relationship that never really quite got off the ground, the two are able to finally be intimate in a way that sort of plays to both of their advantage. Lilith gets to be on top as she always wanted, whilst Adam gets to indulge in fornication and briefly forget about the dire state of his circumstances. Perhaps you might say that whilst Lilith could not adequately serve as a wife, she did, ironically, make for a welcome distraction for Adam, who at that point was probably in two minds as to whether he wanted a wife at all. In essence, you could probably do a lot worse for a one-night stand. Not that Adam had much of a choice at that time, given there were no other people around. Still, you might also point out that the fact Adam sleeps with someone else, whilst still being married to Eve, irrespective of the fact that Eve had already been seduced by Samael, is still a transgression of his own, and seeing as neither he nor Eve could resist the charms of another, perhaps maybe none of them were particularly suited for married life. Another Jewish legend in the Tree of Souls explains that when God created Eve, he had made her into an apparition first, but that she was so beautiful, she was practically the embodiment of the heavens. This account tells us that after Lilith had left the Garden of Eden, necessitating the creation of Eve, Lilith returned to have her way with Adam, but fled at the sight of Eve, whom she couldn't stand to behold because her beauty so greatly transcended her own. For those who value physical beauty above all else, perhaps it would be easy for you to determine Eve as the better wife, because in all likelihood, according to this legend, Eve's physical beauty by far surpassed that of Lilith's. Perhaps this is why, despite marrying Samael in some Jewish legends, and bearing him all of the demonic children she spoke of in the Alphabet of Ben Sira, Samael still takes his chances in the Garden of Eden to court and impregnate Eve, because even he found Eve more attractive and couldn't resist. Another idea suggests that when Lilith returned, before being scared off by Eve's beauty in this Jewish legend, it might have been because she had finally cooled off after her argument with Adam and had matured enough to realize that compromise was a very valid option. Therefore, she returned to the garden to reconcile with Adam, but the moment she had come just so happened to be the moment God was presenting Eve to Adam as a wife. She became so distraught that she'd been replaced so quickly and so overwhelmed by their union that it drove her from the garden once more, and further into her role as the mother of demons. With this idea then, Lilith does show the capacity for change, and she is able to rationalize and do what's right for the relationship, not just what's right for her. This then shows a greater depth of her character, and frames her less as a prideful and stubborn being, and more of a character who's prepared to put her own differences aside for the greater good. Although you could also argue that it takes some extreme and destructive behaviour for her to realise this, and perhaps most people wouldn't be willing to put up with such intense displays of passion before she eventually came around. If we consider only the biblical account, most would probably agree that Eve makes the better wife. In fact, if we're only considering the biblical account, then Eve would be the only wife. However, with the influence the Alphabet of Ben Sira has had with the establishment of a first wife for Adam, one can't help but consider Lilith when dissecting the Adam myths, especially in an episode where we're directly comparing these wives. Yet even with these comparisons, Eve appears to be a no-brainer. Eve is easygoing, she doesn't have an agenda of her own, and she isn't vying for complete control of the sexual or even greater aspects of the relationship's dynamic. It's only with Apocrypha does Eve's character become more tarnished, where she is subject to a most scandalous affair. But even in these legends, Eve's character strives for redemption, and in all the legends I've come across, Adam always does end up with Eve regardless. There is hardly any effort to redeem Lilith in the various legends. She either continues to violate the peace of others and further darkens her own character, or when she is rarely seen to reflect, usually ends up doubling down on her wicked nature. However, there are those who would probably argue that in spite of her wicked ways, Lilith is never seen to actually cheat on Adam, albeit they were hardly together that long before the rift between them started, and with this, some might put forth that Lilith has a level of loyalty that Eve is not shown to replicate. What's more, others might be enticed by the sexual nature of Lilith, who is often portrayed throughout the legends as being a lustful and salacious being who's tantamount to a succubus. Depending on one's values, this, in conjunction with Lilith's rambunctious and exciting personality, might very well scratch an itch for some folk that Eve's comparatively demure nature could only hope to. But let me know who you think the better wife would make, and as always, if you've enjoyed today's episode, then don't forget to leave this video a like and subscribe for more content just like this. Until next time.